Hi guys, this is Daria Piano, and in this video I will share my tips on how to memorize music efficiently and in a reliable way. So you can be completely confident when you go to play that you know the piece through and through. You can start from any point and you know exactly what came before the spot you're playing and what comes after. Knowing each hand separately is also very important. But first, I would like to discuss the types of musical memory that we can use to memorize a piece of music. And it will explain why I chose the one I did and why I find it more effective than others. The first type of musical memory we can employ is the aural type, A-U-R-A-L, and it has to do with our hearing. It works really well for people with perfect pitch because they know exactly what they're hearing and they can immediately play it on the piano. The fingers immediately translate from what they hear. For people like me, or some of you who don't have perfect pitch, that might not be the most effective way, because after you hear and you know what you're hearing, you need to also take another step in order to recognize what is it that you're hearing exactly and find it on the keys. It doesn't happen immediately. Therefore, this is not the most reliable for those of us who do not have perfect pitch. The second type is a visual memory, and of course it works amazingly well for people who hold photographic memory, for example, which is really rare, and some of you gave me comments that some of you do, which is amazing and good for you guys, but unfortunately it's also very rare. And for some of you for whom visual memory is very strong, you might be able to memorize location of certain things on the page in terms of form. That might help you in like a large-scale memory of how the piece progresses, but the details, it's difficult to remember by visual memory. The third type of memory is the muscle memory. And this one is what we use most of the time when we memorize unconsciously. It happens naturally when we repeat things many, many times. Of course, your muscles will remember where to go, even if your brain doesn't remember. That type of memory is the quickest to stick, but it's the least reliable, and we forget it also very quickly. It can, however, save us in the moments when we are really nervous and when our brain shuts down and we feel like, okay, I don't know what's coming next, but I'm just gonna hope for the best and rely on my fingers know where to go. It happens to all of us, I'm sure, who have performance practice on the instrument, on stage, so you know what I mean. But again, this is very unreliable as a type of main memorization tool. Number 4 is the emotional memory. Not many people actually talk about this type of memory, however it is very, very important. And it's my personal subjective opinion that it is the strongest, for people who are emotionally very sensitive, it is the strongest type of memory. Therefore, yes, it is going to probably stick to you the longest time, meaning after 2 or 3 years you might still remember that particular moment if you have an emotional attachment to it. This type of memory happens usually very naturally, and it cannot be forced in a way. You can't recreate artificially the emotional connection to a certain type of music. And I'm not talking about overall, I like this piece. I'm talking about a particular moment in the piece where you feel a certain very strong emotion, and therefore you remember this turn or that phrase, or maybe a whole page if it's a continuous emotion that is being triggered when you play. But unfortunately, again, we can't control that type of memory when it happens. It's great, usually you memorize these moments immediately and you don't have to reinforce that, but we can't rely on that to create a memory of the entire piece that way. Of course, we have possible combinations of all the above, but I will focus here more on the next type. We'll call it number 5, if we're not counting the combinations, and that is a conceptual memory. Conceptual memory, like in anything else in music, also renders an extremely strong effect. Where does it come from? It comes from thorough understanding of all the details, of overall structure, of musical connections, musical events. And that happens from your head. We analyze this and we are very consciously doing it. So we can definitely rely, as long as our brain is turned on, we can rely on something that we have memorized and we have checked that we actually know it. This type of memory, when we can officially use it to memorize, will create that certainty, that confidence, that you know you're going to go there and you know exactly what happens at any point, and you can explain to yourself why it's happening. So in this video, I will talk about this type of memory, the conceptual memory. This conceptual approach to memorization requires a solid understanding of at least basic musical structures. So please be advised that if you're not familiar with things like tonality, scale, maybe tonic, dominant, triads, patterns, sequences, I will be using those terms. And if you're not familiar with them, perhaps it's good for you to familiarize yourself with them first before this video makes full sense to you. In order to use this approach, you first need to make sure that you can confidently play through any spot of the piece using the musical notation if you are using a musical text. It can be very slow tempo, but just make sure that you can read it and you can do it without mistakes. It's very important that you start memorizing correctly, that you later on don't have a situation where you thought you played it correctly, but you were actually playing it wrong the entire time and you memorized it wrong, and then it's going to take you a longer time to adjust it to the correct notes or rhythms or articulation, whatever it is that you memorized wrong. Before you begin memorizing the piece, first thing you need to do is to understand the logic of the composition. Vertically, which requires understanding of harmonic movement, and horizontally, which requires understanding of melodic movement. And I have divided this into 5 subgroups, the steps that you need to take before. First thing is understanding the formal structure of the piece. The bigger points, the bigger rivals, the bigger chapters, we can call it sections or overall form. It could be an ABA form, ternary form, it could be a sonata form with exposition, development, recapitulation. It could be through composed. Anything that you can point out to yourself about the large movement of the piece, where it is going, the trajectory of the piece is very important. And when you do that, try to point out to yourself if you see any repetition, a large scale repetition, or something similar that will make sense to you that these things are connected in a certain way. Maybe section A is connected to the end and they are very similar but just in a different key, and things like that. Number 2 here is understanding the melodic development. How is the main melody changing? You can break it into smaller motifs and see if any of them are being used, maybe shortened, maybe they transfer to a different key, maybe they're sequenced. If there is any pattern you notice in how the melody is developing. Is there a new melody, perhaps, that's coming in the middle? What happens to the melody? Maybe it changes the register, maybe it changes rhythm, maybe it changes the key. All these things just point out to yourself that you understand the logic behind it, what is happening. Number 3 here is understanding the harmonic progression. A good skill to have here, of course, is to understand the tonic, what the concept of tonic is, what is the concept of the dominant, and see if you can point out those relationships, tonic-dominant, which are very frequent in classical Western music. Notice if there are any modulations, which is moving from one key to another. If there is a mode change, maybe from major to minor. Anything that has to do with harmony, the chords, the color that you have under the melody, understanding that, how it moves, and where is the goal, where it starts, if something happens in the middle for the main middle section, and then when something happens to the end, where do you arrive? It's very important. And here also you have to think about moments of cadences and how it is being built. Is there a dominant movement? Is there a half cadence? Is there a full cadence? How can you explain this to yourself? Even if you don't know these terms, is basically Do you have a statement of the tonic key preceded by the dominant? Or is the dominant stopping and then there is something else happening? So think about these structural arrivals in a harmonic way as well. The fourth important thing to notice from the very beginning before we start memorizing is the nuances such as articulation, dynamics. These things are there on purpose, and understanding why they're there but not other things. Why is there piano? Why is there a subito forte? If you can explain logically to yourself why it's happening, you will never confuse those dynamics because it makes sense. It's not random. You don't randomly remember, okay, this second measure is forte, first measure is pianissimo, and this is just because I have to memorize this. But it helps if you understand what the composer meant to say, especially when it has to do with articulation. Try to remember, memorize from the beginning with the articulation. And another important thing here is choosing the right fingering from the beginning, because that's another topic of fingering, but just remember, fingering, articulation, dynamics, all very important. And the last thing here, from the very beginning, important to notice patterns, and if there are any changes to those patterns, even if they're very, very slight. What kind of patterns am I talking about? It could be harmonic pattern, tonic, dominant, tonic, then moving to a different key, tonic, dominant, tonic. Or it could be a melodic pattern. If you're sequencing the same melody, maybe step down, or maybe in a different key, maybe it's a fragment that's being sequenced, but maybe it's repeated and repeated. Oftentimes in etudes, composers will employ that type of movement. And also notice patterns in accompaniment texture. For example, a certain type of accompaniment was happening for a page, and now on the second page it is reversed, or it is somehow changed. Maybe this change is very slight, but you have to remember that and point out, okay, so this relates to this, but with a little bit of a change, right? So things like these immediately try to point out, and you can even be very creative about this. Take different kind of color pencil or pen or highlighter and just literally make a copy. Don't do it in a nicer book, but make a copy of those pages you're playing and just make it as colorful as you need it to be, or use whatever tools you need to mark these things for yourself. Here I would like to insert tip number 1. Start memorizing early on, conceptually, using your head, before your fingers had ample time to memorize on autopilot, and that already will hinder your conscious ability of memorizing with your head, because your fingers will be ahead of your head. Yeah. So try to avoid that.